Good morning and welcome to this last session of this retreat. Without further ado, we'll sit in quiet meditation. To settle our minds and body. Let's now cultivate the merit field with Buddha Shakyamuni in the space in front of us. In the space above facing us, surrounded by his disciples through the ages to the present time. All of them radiating with light, symbolic of their deep-seated compassion, wisdom, all of the positive qualities in varying stages of advancement and growth, and in that of the Buddha, all of the qualities in perfection states. Think of the hardships that they endured in their pursuit of the path leading to their respective stages of advancements and growth to be of benefit to sentient beings, particularly that of the Buddha, having this full consummate advancement, completion, and how from all those inner growth came these marvelous teachings rooted in their own experiences. Beginning with the teachings of the Buddha that he shared to the humanity out of full compassion and wisdom, drawing from his own personal experience, and how the latter masters studied them, examined them, investigated them, put them into practice, validated them, and left the legacies of their writings that are to this day of profound, far-reaching service to all sentient beings, particularly the humanity. Thinking about this generate appreciation, gratitude, leading to inspiration to follow the same path. Think of sentient beings, fellow sentient beings surrounding us, filling the whole space around us, all in human forms, yet undergoing their own respective predicaments, limited conditions. Particularly think of their bondage to the afflictions and the karmas induced by them under the full force of ignorance. Let our attention particularly go to those in the lower realms. Generate a sense of concern. Wondering what could be done. And see the rest of us also being in the same potential to be in the same situation. Being caught in the bondage to the afflictions, except temporarily we are in a relatively better state of being, but nonetheless still within samsaric condition. which is known for its unpredictability, instability, steeped in suffering all the way. Let this reflection going towards the sentient beings generate a sense of true appreciation of our reality, leading to a need to make the utmost of the time while we have it in addressing it. Both to ourselves and to others. And see the root of all of these in ignorance. That could be addressed only through the wisdom, understanding the natural reality. But for that to have the required force to strike the ignorance has to have a firm foundation in concentration that in turn relies on a firm foundation of morality. How all of these elements of the practice needs to be cultivated, strengthened, and brought to full awakening, full completion, which would then assure a state of stability for oneself, from which one could be of the utmost and most effective benefit to all sentient beings. Yes, more importantly, connect with the sentient beings on the levels of our similarity, on the levels of our dependence, on the levels of our being available to each other all the time, provided we have the openness to see that. Despite our own confusions and ignorance, let that generate a heartwarming love, growing into empathy, into compassion, again into full-blown bodhichitta. Seeing the attainment of full awakening to be the ultimate solution, by which, at least on our part, on one's part, one would be fully capable, fully willing in being of the utmost benefit to all sentient beings. Strengthen this aspiration and also wish strongly that before long may this aspiration be fulfilled. With this aspiration in the background, let's say the homage to Buddha Shakyamuni.
To the teacher endowed, transcendent destroyer, one thus gone, for destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to bliss, no, the world's supreme guide, beings to be tamed. Teacher of gods and humans, to you, the Buddha endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. When I was supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides, then said, I am supreme in this world. To you, her wise, that I bow. With pure bodies, form supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, flame that blazes in the three worlds, winner the best, supreme guide to you I bow. With the supreme signs, face like the spotless moon, color like gold to you I bow. You are immaculate, the three worlds are not incomparable, wise one to you I bow. Great, compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms, unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings, the holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, mirage, a flame, a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all-seeing, subdue the four faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, foreland, sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you. May all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Iram Guru Rana Mandala Kandriyatayami.
I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I am awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. Let's hold bodhicitta in our mind, one that we have just generated, wishing to attain nothing short of full awakening for the sake of all sentient beings, for the purpose of bringing all sentient beings to a state of full freedom from suffering, as well as complete freedom from all forms of ignorance. Because that's going to be of the best, utmost benefit to all sentient beings in the truest sense of the word. towards that end, we are going to make our effort in cultivating the paths, including the 3 trainings, leading to the generation of true cessation and true path, and bringing it to further growth into the quality of cessation and path at the level of the Buddha. For that to happen right here and now, we have to attend to the practices that we need to cultivate to serve as a foundation for all those aspired stages to be built upon. And that foundation, among other things, is definitely the practice of Shila, the very foundation. Among the many levels of Shila practice, the very basic is the practice of abstention from the 10 natural non-virtues. And then further enhancing it by adopting the Shila practices of one's own respective vows, beginning with the individual liberation vows of respective orders that one is in, followed by the Bodhisattva levels of practice, or rather adding to that the Bodhisattva Shilas of restraint. So seeing these in perspective, in the context, feel grateful for the opportunity that we have in sharing, discussing, reflecting on this very crucial element of the path. The foundation, the strength of which determines the strength of all the rest to follow, including the practice of bodhichitta and the wisdom of understanding emptiness. So for the sake of all sentient beings, with the aspiration to attain full awakening, we rejoice in this opportunity of studying, learning, discussing, reflecting on the Shila practices of the Bodhisattvas, with its basis rooted in the Shila of individual liberation, or at the very least, at the very basic, the Shila of non-harm. Let this session be dedicated towards the end of finally achieving the full awakening, but in between cultivating the paths required for the sake of all sentient beings. I see a question here. What is the difference between the second and third types of Bodhisattva ethics? Before I do that, I want to go back to yesterday's question about self-centeredness. Is self-centeredness the opposite of no self? We went into complications there. I added only to the complication, not clarifying any point. So I wanted to come back. First and foremost, the opposite of self-centeredness is bodhichitta. And this may not be that apparent, or it may be, but it needs to be thought through. And this gives us a clear identification of what bodhichitta stands for, what self-centeredness stands for. Basically, we have this definition or the idea that self-centeredness is putting oneself above others, prioritizing oneself over others, thinking that we are more important, irrespective of whether we explicitly think so or not. The underlying thought is always that I am more important, that I matter more than others. And what are the damages that that kind of a thought process brings about? But that needs to be thought through also. Doubling down on the limitations, the shortfalls, the drawbacks of being driven by self-centeredness, being dictated by the self-centeredness. One of the very clear impact of unquestioningly accepting self-centeredness, its dictates, is our self-preoccupation, self-obsession. And that adds to our intolerance, adds to our lack of endurance, intolerance, and lack of openness to the opportunities that present themselves to us. Always looking at what's there for me, and thus limiting it to a very, very narrow perspective, very often generating concern, anxiety, worry, almost unceasingly and unwarrantedly, totally missing out on the much bigger potential that the situation could have been experienced. Whereas bodhichitta totally flips that order and puts others above us. Just about everything we do, just about everything, including taking care of ourselves, those are all geared towards benefiting others. In a way it does. I said that irrespective of whether we think or not, that affects what we do. If we do good things, they affect others. They benefit others. But if we miss out on intending to do that, we cannot own that credit. and then one misses out on the great benefit that it could bring in really unlocking so many of our potentials within us. So in a way, this is one of the irony. If you want to be good, do good to others, or think only of others. Think only of others at the exclusion of oneself. Not in the sense that one completely neglect oneself, but one take care of others, oneself, with the intention, with the connection, seeing that it could benefit others, and may it benefit others, be it for them. From a strictly Buddhist perspective, that's how the practice of deity yoga makes sense. Going 24 hours in almost serving the deity that one has imagined on oneself. So that's why we have this yoga of rising, yoga of sleeping, yoga of one feeding with nectar, all of those. It's like 24 hours one one is engaged in accumulating not just merit, but far-reaching merit, because these are all conjoined with the motivation of bodhicitta, and that whole experience of taking on the deity form, being imbued, not just imbued, fully informed by the wisdom of understanding emptiness. And then when one gets better and better and better, the spirit becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. So the cultivation of merit keeps on increasing. 24 hours is not when we think of something or deliberately intend to do that, but rather just from that practice of that practice of going through the cycle of the processes, one can see how that builds the merit. When we speak of merit, sometimes we have a tendency of seeing it outside of our practice, but it is part and parcel of the practice. The strength that we gain of our spiritual cultivations, that is the merit. That could be in the method aspect form, or that would be wisdom aspect form. So basically, when we speak of merit, we are speaking of the strength of our own spiritual cultivation, spiritual environment. So self-centeredness is the opposite of bodhicitta. Whereas when we speak of no self, that's what I was trying to say yesterday. I didn't do a good job. When we try to understand the concept of no self, apart from countering self-centeredness, we can think of two selfnesses, selflessness. Not quite use selflessness, but think of two selflessness in Buddhism. One selflessness is in alignment with bodhicitta, being concerned about the well-being of others, not about oneself. No self-obsession, but thinking of others. That's selflessness, one selflessness, which is more in the method aspect, emotional, affective side. And then the other selflessness has to do with how we see ourselves. What's our sense of our identity of ourselves, identity of others. We tend to have a sense of things having an objective, concrete identity of their own. Particularly when we do that on ourselves, that becomes a breeding ground for all of the afflictions. Afflictions coming from our side, of our justification of the afflictions, based on our mistaken conception that this I is totally unconnected, independent of others. Likewise, when we project that onto other things also, we tend to then be either overly repulsed by, overly attached to, because of this initial notion of things being self-enclosed, intrinsically existent. So basically what I'm saying is, think of two types of selflessness. One is the practice of bodhicitta, which counteracts self-centeredness, selfishness, self-centeredness. The other selflessness is saying there is self, but not the way you see it. There is self, nonetheless, but self merely contingent on its basis of designations, on its parts, and functional only on that basis. Everything around is contingent, dependently, relatedly existing, not with any kind of intrinsic identity. So is the self, so is oneself. So one is lacking that kind of a mistakenly projected notion of some kind of a solidity. And that understanding is called selflessness. Seeing the self lack of that projected objective reality, objective self-enclosed existence. And that selflessness is the same as no self. So basically, self-centeredness, the opposite of that is bodhicitta. And self-centeredness is the opposite of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is the opposite of self-centeredness. There's another question here. What's the difference between the second and the third types of bodhisattva practice, bodhisattva ethics? The second type of bodhisattva ethics is the ethics of virtue, right? The ethics of gathering the virtue. That includes ethics of engaging in the 6 paramitas. And then we speak separately of that, of the practice of benefiting others. So yeah, this is a very valid question here. Remember, we spoke of how the perfection practice is classed, is put in the category of taking care of one's own growth, in strengthening one's inner growth, in ripening and in ripening oneself, in making oneself, in maturing oneself. So the perfection practices mainly what to focus on when we engage in perfection practice. One side of that is cultivating the proper spirit of it, the proper spirit of it. So each one of them has to be identified with their proper spirit, the proper unmistaken spirit that needs to be captured and cultivated. So that's the inner growth. But that's not merely to contain within oneself, but to reach out and help sentient beings. So in the process of doing that, we are faced with actual situations. And thus, in actual situations, how one is supposed to respond to. So there are particular formats, if you will, or the particular way of responding to situation, or the way of responding to the circumstances that presents to us. And there are particular precepts there by which how one is supposed to respond to them is very clearly delineated, clearly demarcated. So the third type of bodhisattva ethics, the ethics of benefiting sentient beings, I think we can touch on it right now. There, it presents us with practical situations, saying, in such a situation, how one is supposed to respond to. In such a situation, how one is to respond to. Failure of which then amounts to breaching that particular precept. That's a way of bringing the bodhisattva practices, the 6 paramita practices, out in actual life. So that part is emphasized in the bodhisattva ethics of serving sentient beings. But in the ethics of cultivating virtue, the inner work is emphasized. The inner work is emphasized. So both of them are very important. But more important is the inner work first. Sometimes we rush into helping some, without necessarily the inner strength of the inner growth properly cultivated. And sometimes we ourselves become, over time, tired or fatigued or, what's the term? Burned out. Like that. And sometimes, those are many of them are so clear that one has not done the homework of first building the inner spirit properly. And thus one runs out of that over time. So that's the reason why these 2 aspects of almost the same thing is emphasized separately. Yeah, but those are not totally kind of separate identities, separate things, but they are. But one could kind of emphasize them differently. So, in the Bodhisattva ethics of benefiting others, the practical scenario is presented there, and the precepts are laid in place in terms of how one should respond to that, and in what situation, what way the precept would have been transgressed, and even if so, with what level of gravity, or in certain situations, one may not be able to respond to the situation, but given one's own situation, whether that would be a case of no transgression at all or not. So that's clearly spelled out. That way one gets a very clear, guidance in how to steer oneself through the situation. One thing important, interesting to see is even in the ethics of restraint. Even in the ethics of restraint, we speak of the 18 root precepts. Apart from that, we speak of these 46 secondary precepts. The 46 among the 46 secondary precepts, 12 are associated with the ethics of benefiting others, and the rest 34 are associated with the ethics of virtue. I'll clear it up. It may be a little confusing, but these 46 secondary precepts, they fall in the precept in the ethics of restraint. Ethics of restraint. What to restrain from in the face of such a situation, and how not to fall to the force of afflictions that keeps one from in reacting with the situation. So in a way, the actual practices of the Bodhisattva ethics, as spelled out here in these three categories, they have to be seen in their own perspective clearly, in that when we I think I again confused you. Yeah, I again confused you. Let me say, with regard to the question about the difference between the second and the third type of Bodhisattva practice, the second is primarily working with oneself in cultivating the inner strength of them, be it the six perfections, whatnot. Although one is practicing the six perfections, but here the main focus is in getting the spirit right and increasing it, enhancing it, and bringing that aspect of the practice, which is the more important one, to fuller and fuller expression, fuller and fuller growth. Whereas the ethics of working for the well-being of others, it is more about the practical application of it in the face of certain situations. That's why it speaks of 11 situations where 11 sorts of sentient beings, and there's even 11 sorts of, in a way, situation, but it's called 11 sorts of sentient beings because you are reacting, you are responding, interacting with situations involving sentient beings that you're presented with, and it lays out not precepts, it lays out what you should be, how you should be responding to them. But when it comes to actually laying precepts of how failing to do that will incur breach and transgression. Those are all included in the ethics of restraint, even though they are associated with the remaining two ethics. So what I meant is, any specific precepts associated with even the remaining two ethics are part of the ethics of restraint. Whereas outside of that, when we speak of the ethics of the second and the third type, we are speaking not in terms of precepts, but in terms of the general nature of the practice, of working to cultivate the inner strength of the practices, and also being aware of the need to respond to the situations as they present to us. But when it comes to actually acting them out in particular situation, there are specific precepts laid out, failing which you incur the breach. And because it is in the spirit of precept with transgression involved, it is included in the ethics of restraint. Did it make sense? Some sense? Or did it confuse you? Okay, let me say like this: the Bodhisattva ethics of restraint, the Bodhisattva precept or the ethics of restraint includes restraining from 18 root transgressions. We usually speak of not 18 precepts, 18 downfalls to restrain from, plus 46 secondary downfalls to restrain from, right? Restrain from. That's the reason all of those will be within the ethics of restraint. But then we have heard that the 46 secondary precepts, how do we account for? Out of them, 34 are associated with the ethics of virtue, and the remaining 12 are associated with the ethics of benefiting others. So then what is left of ethics of, we'll ask, what is left of ethics of virtue and ethics of altruism, right? Because the precepts associated with them are included in the ethics of restraint. They are included in the ethics of restraint because they are presented in the form of downfalls that you have to practice restraining from, right? But they are in spirit associated with the virtue of accumulating the ethics of virtue and ethics of benefiting sentient beings, in that they present actual scenarios in which one has the guideline of how to respond to that. Now the question is, what is left of, outside of that, what is left of the ethics of virtue and the ethics of benefiting others? So, although they are not that completely unconnected, but if we want to think outside of that, because the precepts associated with them are included in the ethics of restraint, we can think of the ethics of virtue in general as the practice of cultivating the virtues, as the practice of, say, in the case of the practice of virtue, the practice of, the emphasis on the practice of cultivating the inner spirit of those practices in general. But when it comes to specific situations, in terms of expressing it, in terms of bringing it out in the actual life, then it is presented in what would be advised to do, what would be transgression, what would be permitted. And that's how it is included in the ethics of the restraint. Then likewise, in the case of ethics of benefiting sentient beings, we are presented with 11 scenarios. Now you've heard me saying 11 and 12, what's the deal here, right? So when it comes to saying the ethics of benefiting sentient beings, we usually speak of the ethics of benefiting 11 sorts of sentient beings. So sentient beings are not in a clear-cut divisions, but kind of presented in different scenarios of being suffering, of being lost, of being poor, of being confused, etc., etc. Those, and then sentient beings who we live with, who we have responsibility towards, like that. That's how the 11 categories of sentient beings are laid out. And the ethics of benefiting sentient beings in that spirit is being open to them and being aware of being beneficial to them. But when it comes to how beneficial, then given the particular situation, one has special precepts to follow, the failure of which will then incur breach. Right? So basically, transgressions associated with cultivating virtue, associated with benefiting others, they are included in the ethics of restraint. But they are not that completely separate from those ethics themselves, because on top of generally emphasizing that you have to be open to benefiting sentient beings of these different sorts, when it comes to actual playing it out, then they are presented through the lens of precepts. Okay. Pardon? Yeah, yes, please. Could you please bring up the slides?
Is this mostly because these were formulated later, like they went through all these various sutras and writings and then made these lists, right? So like in the different writings that these came from, like you were saying, 13 or 14 of these came from one text, and these were kind of organized later in time, where they went back and found things in the scriptures and writings and then made this kind of ethical restraint practice out of it?
Yeah, that's the reason why we find differences among traditions in terms of the number of precepts of a bodhisattva. That's where I found most differences there. And some have very little, number-wise, very little precepts. But I think, I'm not so sure, but I have same sense that it might be the case among the Tibetan traditions as well. I may be wrong, but I usually sense that it might be the case, because there's this open possibility of that. For the Geluks, we followed Tsongkhapa, and he sorted this out from different sources. One, as I said earlier, was from Kristigarbha Sutra, where 14 of those precepts, 14 of the when we speak of the different sources, we are particularly speaking of the 18 root precepts, 18 root downfalls. 18 root downfalls. But the 18 root downfalls, out of which 14 or 13 came from the Kristigarbha Sutra. And one is, I think, associated with Laptu, I think. Shiksha Samuchaya, I think. Yeah, I think that's from Changsa, from Bodhisattva Bhumi. And there was another source where the four came from Changsa, I think, Bodhisattva Bhumi. And one came from Lapti, I think. But that's mainly speaking of the root precepts of about the 46 secondary precepts. They're from, I think, not just I think, they're from the very short text called the Tomba Nishu. Sanju Sembe Tomba. Nishu, and here Nishu referring to 20 stanzas that capture all of the 46 secondary precepts, as well as 4 of the root precepts from Chandragomi's text. So they have their sources in the sutras. I'm quite positive that even the ones from Jangsa, they must come from sutras. They have their sources there, but they have been kind of put together into a complete source. Yeah.
Can I map the ethical discipline of gathering virtue with the 6 perfection out of the 10 and the last 4 into the ethics of working for the welfare of others?
Can you map what?
The 6 of the 10 perfections into the second and the last 4 of the perfections into the third category. Is that a way that I can understand it?
Speaking of 10 perfections.
Yeah, so 6 into the second and the last 4 into the third. Can I understand that in that way?
The last 4 into the third one is I'm not sure, but in mapping the 6 perfections onto the restraint of the Shila of virtue, that's the way.
So like the power and the aspirations and all that, can it go into the third category?
Oh, that may be a little difficult.
Okay.
I haven't seen any sources for that, and in a way, everything to do with the morality of benefiting others doesn't necessarily confine itself to just those 4. Although those 4 can be very comprehensive if thought of, but not in exclusion of the first 6 perfections. Because situations involve practice about generosity, ethics, all of those in the third virtue. Yeah, that's what I was going to come to make it a little clearer based on this question. See, I'm finding I didn't leave the. Yes, now I have the right. My computer was being hot, and so I closed it. I didn't have the proper version of the slides up. Yeah, so the 36, the 34 precepts associated, the 34 secondary precepts associated with the virtue, with the ethics of virtue, is divided up into, it's mapped out on the 6 perfections. But the 12 of the virtue of altruism. That's not what I found. I didn't find it to be mapped onto the 6 perfections or the remaining 4. That would be, it may be done, but I doubt it, because the remaining 6 perfections, remaining 4 perfections of the 10, if you think of them in exclusion of the first 6, then it will be a little difficult, because the scenario in the practice of morality or the altruism includes scenarios associated with the first 6 perfections. Yeah, let me get to the... So the reason why I was switching between 12 and 11 with in association with the ethics of altruism is because when it is spoken of in terms of precepts, particular precepts, it is presenting particular scenarios in the face of which whenever one has a particular guideline to follow, failing which one could incur transgression of one kind or the lesser gravity, or given one's own situation, in the face of such situation, even if one fails to respond to that, one could be exempt from any kind of transgression. So approach from the transgression point of view, saying how one would transgress them, then the 12 situations are presented. But apart from that, instead of speaking from the precepts point of view, kind of generally presenting what are the categories of sentient beings one will have to be aware of in practicing altruism, it presents 11 situations. So that's a standard number for when we speak of the precept, the ethics of altruism. But when we speak of that precept, that ethics from a precept point of view, then it kind of breaks into 12 situations. Yeah, the 46. Of the 46, the 34 are associated with the virtue, the ethics of virtue, and they are divided up into the 6 perfections. They are kind of mapped out into 6 perfections. But the 12 of these benefit, the ethics of altruism, I don't know how one could map it out onto 6 perfections or the 4 perfections. I haven't come across that. Yeah, one of the sutras is Tabla-kebedo, the sutra on skillful means. So that's where one precept comes, and the Bodhisattva Bhumi, I was earlier mistaking it for Siksha Samochaya, but it is one of the sutras called Tabla-kebedo, skillful means, the sutra of skillful means. That's where one of them come, one of the 18 precepts come, and with regard to the Bodhisattva Bhumi, which is the basis on which Chandragomi's composition of the 20 verses was based on. And that's where the 18 root precepts are presented. No, not 18. That's where 4 of the root precepts are presented. And they are all drawn from Bodhisattva Bhumi.
Up to my dictionary, Chandragomi's text is called 20 Verses of the Bodhisattva Precepts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. that's where the 46 precepts also come out. On top of that, the only 4 of the root precepts are captured there. I think that may be the reason why different traditions list them differently, based just on particular. But Longkapa did an overall search and put them together. I didn't expect to go into this detail because in this session, this is quite an open discussion and might leave out others who may not be directly connected with it. So we've already done it. So let's look at the. Yeah, we're back to contextualizing the 3 precepts, the 3 virtues of the Bodhisattvas, the virtue of restraint, the virtue of, not the virtue, the ethics of restraint, the ethics of virtue, the ethics of altruism. So out of them, we have been emphasizing that the first one is very important, and they are important in relation to the other 2 also. The first practice is very essential in the overall, from a general, from the larger scale point of view also, practice, larger scale view of the practice of the Bodhisattvas, the ethics of restraint is very important. But then in relation to the other 2 of the ethics also, it has a special role in relation to that. So it is especially important in the beginning for Bodhisattvas. One thing to remember, maybe I missed in mentioning that, was when we were dealing with the ethics of restraint, we were mainly speaking in terms of the restraint against the 10 non-virtues. So that is because those 10 non-virtues involve natural negativity. So irrespective of whether one has taken a particular precept or not, those are to be avoided from a Buddhist perspective for everyone, right? For everyone, because of their natural negativity, and thus not incurring breach any kind, but generating suffering, leading to suffering. Non-virtuous actions generating suffering. So when we take precepts, we do not take precept right away against all of those 10. It will be a little difficult. And even among them also, we do not take, say, a precept against killing in a general sense, no killing at all. That would be a little difficult to keep also. So with practicality in view, even though we take precepts against them, against these misdeeds, we kind of specify what particular type, what particular form of killing are we taking the precept against. And that makes perfect sense in terms of, because after all, Buddhism recognizes that afflictions are the main culprit. They are the main source of all these negative actions leading to suffering. So if it were to be possible for precepts to be, if it were to be possible for people to, observe the precepts for anything, then one could have just right away started with precepts against afflictions. But that would not be possible, right? We cannot lay precepts against afflictions, because afflictions at our level seem to come because of our habituation on their own. So there will be always a transgression there with nothing we can do about that. So there's some very interesting insight into Buddha's skillfulness, compassion, and even when he laid out the precepts also in terms of the bhikshus and the sramanaras, bhikshu, bhikshunis, sramanara, sramanaris practice. Is there any origin stories for the upasaki precepts, how they're laid out? I don't think they are separate. Any origin stories separate for the upasaki?
in the Chinese tradition, there's a sutra on the lay people's precepts, and I've only read the ones in the Pali canon.
Yeah, but with origin stories?
No, I think there's an origin story for the. I'll check the Chinese sutra, not in the Pali canon.
I see. Yeah. So I was wondering, I haven't come across that. Usually we speak of the origin stories, we particularly see that in the light of the bhikshu bhikshuni precepts, not even of the shamanaris necessarily. They may have been then adopted from there. So even when it came to laying down the precepts also, Buddha went, he could have just said, this is how you should do, I know, right? But he didn't do that. He did it so skillfully, waiting for precedence. When somebody goes too far, and then there was an apparent recognition that that was not to be, then a precept was laid. He had that patience in waiting for these incidents to unfold. What that means is, whoever happens to engage in that negativity for the first time is exempt of any transgression. So he gets a free hand, he or she gets a free hand, and all the rest gets rules imposed against that. But Buddha had the patience, skillfulness to wait for that. It was so beautiful. And then when we look into the precepts themselves, when it comes to sickness, there's always the exemption. If it is a sick person, even if he or she is holding a sword, I mean, it's so beautiful, so beautiful. Despite his omniscience, he didn't impose it to sentient beings. So what I was saying was, even we speak of the ethics of restraint also, the ethics of restraint, when it comes to precepts being laid out on them, then they begin with what is practical. What is practical and what is practical and relevant to the state of one's spiritual journey. And then it is then eventually kind of, eventually broadened to eventually even zoom into the afflictions. So when it comes to Bodhisattva precepts and also the Vajrayana precepts, then you could see the precepts are no more only limited to the physical and verbal expressions, but they are even dealing with the afflictions themselves. And that speaks of the level of practice at that time. Now they have some control and control over the afflictions themselves, and they can allow themselves to fall for them or not. So based on that the precepts are presented. And that's the reason why we say in Vajrayana, even if one doesn't do any practice, just strictly observe the precepts, that's enough to land oneself to Buddhahood. And that's because the precepts deal with the afflictions now. And all of that takes for Buddhist practice to attain the stages of attainment. It deals with how strongly you deal with the afflictions, how thoroughly you deal with it, and clear the affliction and residues of the afflictions. So even for bodhisattvas also, for the beginners, the ethics of restraint is the most important, and that's the basic foundation for the rest of the two ethics to be founded on. Let's look at the next one. The rules of individual liberation or its associates are one aspect of the precepts of the Bodhisattva vow. So once one has taken the Bodhisattva vow, then whatever one has in the foundation, whatever one has started out with before taking on the Bodhisattva vow, in terms of either any one of the individual liberation vows, or even without that, at the very least one could have taken a vow against killing. That could be the starting point, right? So some could be already with a full-fledged individual liberation vow, but some may not be. But at the very least, it has to have some basis some basis to kind of to stand on, and that could be as simple as a precept against killing, not with any formal vow as such. But in any way, whatever one has taken before taking the Bodhisattva vow, it becomes part and parcel of the Bodhisattva vow. One should not think that this is individual liberation vow, I can now, ignore it or like that. It gets built up as we take the higher vows. Next one, please. Yeah, it emphasizes the same thing. If the ethical discipline of restraint degenerates, the other two also degenerate. Next one, please. It's the foundation of the remaining two. Okay, that's the same emphasis. Practice of giving up any deed that is wrong by nature. Yes, among the restraint, irrespective of whether one has a precept about that or not, first and foremost, among the precepts of restraint, the first and foremost is the precept or the practice of restraint against the natural misdeeds. If one has taken a particular precept about that, then that's the priority. That's the main thing. And then, on top of that, then the precepts against deeds that are wrong by stipulation kind of follow. So this kind of way of seeing these aspects of the precepts or the aspects of the ethical discipline in perspective. Do we have any next to this? Okay. Based on the level of grossness and gravity, deeds that are wrong by nature are uniformly listed as the 10 non-virtues in all the vehicles in Buddhism. So these 10 non-virtues do not exhaust all the non-virtues, but they have been put in place in this list, recognizing the grossness of them. They are quite gross and are also grave in their results. And based on that, they have been put together. And this is something uniformly accepted and uniformly accepted in all the vehicles within Buddhism. Okay, let's see what we have next. Yeah, I thought those will be some practical insights into how we proceed in training in the ethical disciplines. It says, don't let, I have pulled them up from either Lamrim or the illumination of the intent, and maybe from Mulchu Tome Sangbo. Mulchu Dhammabhadra's commentary on Tsongkhapa's work on Bodhisattva precepts. So, don't let weaken but increase steadily the spirit of enlightenment. So we are talking of Bodhisattva practice, although on the ethical practice. But whatever practice that the Bodhisattvas do, the very basis of that is the bodhichitta. One should not lose sight of that as a Bodhisattva. So that's what is being emphasized here. Don't let weaken but increase steadily the spirit of bodhicitta, spirit of enlightenment. That's the bodhicitta. And that's the basis of the Bodhisattva deeds. So when we speak of Bodhisattva deeds, particularly bound by a vow or a precept, then we are talking of it at a later stage, after having been a while as a Bodhisattva with bodhicitta. But then all throughout, it's the spirit of enlightenment or bodhicitta that kind of sustains the whole practice. And that's, one should not lose sight of that. And always watch out for any ways by which it could be weakened, and keep away from that, and instead work on increasing it. We have the next one. It's the root of engaging in ethical discipline and other parameters. For Bodhisattva, that's the root. Bodhicitta is the root for all of its practices, and we all know that, right? Because Bodhisattva, one becomes bodhisattva when one has generated bodhicitta. This aspiration, genuine aspiration to attain awakening, is what makes someone bodhisattva. And that's the very root, the foundation for all of the paramitas, including the ethical discipline. Next, please. Yeah, and then sometimes, and then we should not think that the practice of ethics, etc., has to come totally outside of bodhicitta. Just the spirit of bodhicitta itself kind of covers a large ground in our practices, and so many of the afflictions that we engage in would naturally be kind of talked out of once we honor and what you call nurture the spirit of bodhicitta. So I'm bringing this up to emphasize, right? To emphasize the aspects of bodhicitta in preparation to work for in preparation to deal with the other practices, including morality. Let's see, what's the next? Start with the ethical discipline of a beginning bodhisattva while aspiring. So, in terms of, I think that might be the case with individual liberation, but not as much. In case of individual liberation, many of the precepts, just about all of the precepts, one is supposed to be able to observe, and if they are not, there are means of confessing for them, and means of means of being exempted from them. But in case of bodhisattva precepts, many of the precepts are something that bodhisattvas of higher training, higher growth can uphold. Not everyone can be expected. So one's approach to them is to kind of have an aspiration to be able to do that, but also being very practical that that's not what you can do at the moment. So that's kind of a spirit one is supposed to have towards the different levels of precepts, not kind of expect oneself to observe them all at once. Next. Each day, frequently exercise an attitude of restraint with respect to what you know about deeds that are wrong by nature, such as the 10 non-virtues, and the deeds that are wrong by stipulation, not prohibition, stipulation. So that means just as we do the refuge prayer, remembrance of the refuge, as well as recalling the spirit of bodhicitta over time, right? Frequently in the daytime. Likewise, one is supposed to kind of generate this remembrance of what are the precepts one has taken, and so kind of remembering them makes one more prepared and aware of the situations when one has to exercise the caution. Next, please. Among these, also strive again and again to apply an attitude of restraint towards the fundamental transgressions of the vow. So when we speak of the ethics of restraint, those are the 10 non-virtues are the fundamental ones to restrain from. But then, having taken a precept, one would now have an additional obligation, obligation to be aware of the precepts one has taken. Because when we breach that particular rule or so, one incurs breach of the precepts as well as incur what you call the non-misdeed from it, the natural misdeed also. So in terms of the ethics of restraint, it is not just always just the restraint against the natural misdeeds, but also additionally the ethics, the precepts that one has accepted, that goes with the level of vows one has taken, and that will include even that of the Bodhisattvas also. There are points to restraint. So those are to be aware of. Let's see the next, if there is. Okay. If you do this, now this is important. If you do this as a causally concordant behavior, because we are in kind of practicing in this behavior of being aware of the restraints and also trying to kind of exercise them in the face of situations, whatnot. As we do that, we become better and better in them. And thus, not in just that same lifetime, we'll become easier in observing them. The difficulty that we used to feel would be less and less. But over time, even after death, in other lifetimes also, we would be keeping that habituation. And because of that, with proper conditions, kind of activating it, one will be able to kind of bring that up and be able to benefit from that. So that's why we see differences in how people respond to precepts. Some have very great difficulty with regard to one particular one. Others don't have that much. Those could be reasons of why. There could be reasons. Those could be because one may have exercised them or engaged in them, have had some kind of a experience in them in the past lives like that. I've heard of this. Venerable Pema was sharing it in that house that they were staying during our evacuation. That house spoke of a cat which had that natural restraint against anything. Yeah, I see. Yeah, could you share a little bit about what you observed?
Was not a typical cat.
Mm-hmm.
So he had no interest in going outside unless we went outside and if it was sunny. And he would just go right on our patio, right by the door. And he never was interested in insects, mice, birds. He wasn't really that interested in food. He just ate to stay alive. And he mostly just liked being near people, and he would, wherever people would go, he would follow them. Mm-hmm. And whenever somebody new came to the house, he would meet them. He'd be at the door, and then he'd follow them around and really kind of observe them, and it's very peaceful.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's definitely naturally coming from the cat, and now the question is, how come that is natural? So usually in the scriptures we speak of this causally concordant behavioral effect of any action. If that is a bad action, you would be creating that kind of a concordant behavioral pattern or behavioral trait. So irrespective of whether it's a positive action, negative action, on top of experiencing their karmic impelling effects, one also would carry their concordant behavioral effects also. So who knows, that could be what's happening there. Let's see, what's the next? Could we see what's the next? Okay, that's as advice coming from, I think, Tsongkhapa, saying, strive at this right now, not leave it for a later time. And also being very practical, that strive at what you are able to do. What you are able to do, don't lag behind that. But what you are not able to do, at least have the aspiration to be able to do it, and then work towards that. That's very practical, and rather than kind of beating oneself up, saying, "Oh, I could not do this." If that's beyond your reach, be very practical in accepting that, but also aspire to engage in it in later times. But be very, very, what do you call, very practical and very true to oneself. Yes, true to oneself in doing one's best. And that's how, from one's own given situation, given state of being, the improvement can be expected, because one is being true to where one is, and whatever one is capable of, one is bringing that up. That's how, on the actual practical level, development or improvement happens. Okay, let's see, what's the next? So in Lamrim Chemo, Tsongkhapa speaks of how these practice of ethical disciplines can be carried out in association with all the 6 perfections. Even if one is primarily engaging in the generosity, practice of generosity, one could bring in all the aspects of 6 perfections to kind of bear on. Likewise, he speaks of this called the 6 supremacies. I don't know how to translate it properly, but it's Tambatu. And it's a way kind of, it's almost like saying how to bring in these elements of doing it in the best way possible, maybe. Supremacies in that sense. Saying, kind of make sure that the basis is supreme. The basis on which you practice it, right? Since we are speaking of bodhisattvas, the basis is obviously the bodhichitta, the spirit and enlightenment. So make sure or be aware that that is in place. To the extent we have generated bodhicitta, whatever level of bodhicitta we may have, kind of bring that into play, bring that into place, and make sure that is not overlooked. Second one, we'll just cover this and then leave it there. Second one, supreme focus. So here we are talking of each perfection would have a particular perfect, proper, appropriate focus to land on, to place on. So in the case of ethical disciplines, kind of don't leave out any precept, in the sense that mentally just don't give up on any precept. Even those that are hard to observe right now, at least at least aspire to observe them when one is capable, and not kind of completely mentally kind of give up on them and kind of disregard them. Third, let's see, supreme aim, yes. So it is the same as bodhicitta, but earlier it was saying on the basis of bodhicitta you do this practice, but then in terms of where you aim this, where you kind of dedicate it, you do it not just for yourself, not for yourself, but for the immediate and ultimate benefit of all sentient beings. So that's alluding to what I think Nicole asked yesterday about what we meant by aims. I said meeting the needs, but that's meeting the needs and goals of the sentient beings. Needs are immediate needs. The goal is what sentient beings may not be aware of, but in an indirect way they have that in wishing happiness, but in terms of how that could be, they may not have that clear idea. But the bodhisattvas have that, so they also dedicate all the practices, including whatever they are, including ethical discipline, towards this goal. Let's see the next one. The means of doing that. The means of doing that, the best means of doing that, the best complementary means to bring in, to factor in whatever practice one does, is this wisdom of understanding emptiness. And at its most ideal form, it could be a wisdom of understanding emptiness directly. But that would be not practical for beginners. For beginner bodhisattvas, to the extent possible, kind of bring this wisdom aspect to bear on whatever action one is doing. So not just be content with doing it, but do so within this spirit of how everything lacks inherent existence, and they are kind of merely contingent on conditions and whatnot. Right? So that kind of keeps away unwanted elements to creep in that practice and make it just mundane level practice, not super mundane. And then supreme dedication. Yeah, it's again dedicating the virtue, making sure that any practice, after the practice, any practice that one does, dedicate that virtue. Don't leave it just undedicated, but kind of dedicate it. The supreme purity, in the sense that keep the practice as pure as possible by making sure that relevant to your own level of capacity, counteracting both aspects of afflictive and cognitive obscurations, which means keep the practice as free as possible from afflictions and keep the practice as free as possible from any possible degrees of grasping at it in an inherent existence form. Okay, I think we should leave it. Could you go to... Okay, next one. Quickly go through this. We'll not discuss this. Yeah, okay. Sorry, we cannot recite this. But let's recite this. Okay, yeah, in English. The 4 lines. Changchup sembe chudimni machak michak chakpame chakwani jamayinde machak michak chakpame. Let's recite this together. And this puts the Bodhisattva's ethics in perspective. It says, keep the precept practice unattached, which means unspoiled by misdeeds. Second one is unspoiled by a sense of procrastination, and unattached or untouched by a sense of just little will do, unattached by any self-interest in this life, any interest for return in this life for oneself, no attachment for any karmic result for oneself in the next life, solely dedicated for the benefit of others. And then the last one is keep that untouched, unspoiled, untouched by grasping, and also untouched by even subtle stains of afflictions like that. So that way, it puts in practice any perfection practice of the Bodhisattva in the purest form as possible, kind of keeping the spirit very clear. So let's recite these in Tibetan first. Changchup sempe chudim ni machak michak chakpa me chakpa nijang mainte machak michak chakpa me. Now we will sing it. Changchup sempe chudim ni machak michak chakpa me chakpa nijang mainte machak michak chakpa me. Okay. And this is drawn from the Maitreya's text on Ornament of Sutras, which puts the Bodhisattva's practice in perspective in terms of how to maintain the purity of it. So Bodhisattvas, they go so far in counteracting self-centeredness that the practices they do, they do not have any expectation for them to bring any good birth for themselves, any reward in return for this life, any result in terms of good birth for themselves in the next life. We left out one thing. Not even the expectation that this will land me to my personal liberation. Even that is left out. solely for full attainment, that too for the sake of all sentient beings. So the spirit of bodhichitta, countering self-centeredness, goes so deep, thoroughly. But that's something we can aspire to be able to do, but not practical right away. Let's look at the next one. This is so crucial. This is from His Holiness the Dalai Lama in September 2018, when he was teaching to East and Southeast Asian people. I first began to develop an interest in emptiness when I was about 14 or 15 years old and engaged in rigorous study. However, I only gained some experience of understanding it when I was about 30. That's emptiness, the wisdom of emptiness. Cultivating altruism, that is bodhicitta. Cultivating altruism and a thorough understanding of emptiness are my main practices. Fulfilling them requires study, reflection, and meditation. I bear the name of the Dalai Lama because whatever insight I have, I bear the name of the Dalai Lama, but whatever insight I have achieved is the result of my own efforts. Therefore, my blessing to you is to encourage you to study, 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 and then reflect, 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 and then meditate, meditate, meditate. To be coming from Him, it's very humbling, and at the same time very eye-opening. And that everything, eye-opening and reassuring that everything that happens because of causes and conditions met, not otherwise. No one is exception. Yeah, with that we'll stop here. And whoever wants this, whoever is interested in the slides, they can have this. Yeah, they're online? They're already online, so. Mm-hmm.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in 10 directions. May the light of love song's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam gururana mandalakam niryatayami.
Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their sufferings. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May the born have no decline, but increase forevermore. In the snowy mountain pure land, you're the source of good and happiness. Powerful Tenzin Chodrak, may you stay until samsara ends. May the deeds of explaining and practicing the Dharma, done by groups supporting the teachings and their upholders, who spread the view of dependent arising and non-violent actions in the 10 directions, and especially at Sravasti Abbey in the West, flourish. welcome. You are welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Most welcome. Yeah. Most welcome. Thank you. Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you. Oh, what's this? For Ladakh? Thank you so much. Oh yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, that's it. That's it. Oh, that's it. That's it. Oh, that's it. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, baby. You want? Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's it. Thank you. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yes, Bodhisattva, thank you. You must welcome. Okay, bye. That's it. Ah, thank you. Yes, thank you. Best welcome. Thank you, Claude. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, that's it. That's it. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Okay.